I am so thrilled that I have an amendment that the gentleman from Florida has an amendment that I can support. I join with you and urge everyone to support the gentleman's amendment.
Gentleman from New Jersey controls the time.
I could yield to you, Mr. Stearns. Yes.
I thank the gentleman, and I thank my gentleman. Oftentimes I give him an amendment which he has very little time to look at. Again, this happened, but I am very pleased he's supporting my amendment. And with that, obviously, I will not call for a vote, and I appreciate the appropriators supporting my amendment.
I yield back.
Gentleman from New Jersey yields back. The question is on the amendment offered by the gentleman from Florida. Those in favor say aye. Those opposed, no. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it. The amendment is agreed to. For purposes, the gentleman from Texas rise.
Mr. Chairman, I have an amendment at the desk.
Clerk will report the amendment.
Amendment offered by Mr. Sessions of Texas, page 31, line 17. After the dollar amount, insert reduced by $10 million. Page 33, line 18, after the dollar amount, insert increase by $10 million. Page 34, line 1, after the dollar amount, insert increase by $10 million.
The gentleman from Texas is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, first I'd like to recognize, if I can, the gentleman, C.W. Bill Young, who is a stalwart not only to this Congress but also to the men and women of the United States military, for his hard work in support of not only making sure our men and women have what they need, but to make sure that what he stands behind that, to make sure that they get money well spent on behalf of taxpayers. Also, I'd like to thank Chairman Hal Rogers and certainly the gentleman from Washington, Norm Dix, for their hard work and dedication to trying to work on traumatic brain injury, known as TBI, and also post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD. And to thank all three of them and others in this Congress for their continued support by increasing funding for TBI and PTSD in this overall bill by $125 million. While I understand the longstanding practice of the committee for not designating specific TBI funds, my amendment confirms the House's support for this amendment, which I have offered many times and certainly related to TBI in May of this year to the National Defense Authorization Act of 2011. I would yield.
Explain to me that the $10 million would not be part of the government program, that this would give people with traumatic brain injury, post-traumatic stress disorder, an option to go to the private sector?
In fact, that is correct. What has previously been in the Defense Armed Services Committee, the policy that would allow men and women of the military who have TBI to be able to take these funds and be able to use them outside of the Department of Defense to what I would call private sector.
What about TRICARE, which is a private company, but they do?
It certainly, they can take it where they choose to, not where they are designated to go by the Department of Defense. That would be correct.
Thank you for yielding.
On May 26 of 2011, during the NDAA debate, the House unanimously adopted an amendment to create a pilot program administered by the Department of Defense that would begin treating our troops coming back home from theater with TBI and PTSD. Today, Congress has the opportunity to appropriate funds that would be used to treat our active duty and veterans suffering from TBI and PTSD. My amendment specifically moves $10 million from the more than $19 billion in the Research, Development, Test, and Evaluation Defense Program to increase the Defense Health Program by $10 million once again. This money will assist directly to these soldiers and others in the military who have TBI-related injuries to be able to go to private sector facilities with the utilization of taxpayer dollars for them to get leading-edge treatments on these issues. In April 2007, the Department of Veterans Affairs screened veterans who were serving in Iraq and Afghanistan since October 2001 for symptoms associated with TBI. More than 19% of these veterans screened positive for TBI symptoms. This is a big issue. According to the U.S. Army, the number of soldiers leaving active duty service has increased by 64% from 2005 to 2009 due to brain health, whether it was TBI, PTSD, or a mental illness. A 2009 RAND study estimates that costs related to depression, PTSD, and TBI in our soldiers ranges from $4 billion to $6.2 billion over a 2-year period of time. Today, healthcare providers all over this country are treating healthcare people are treating brain injury patients with new and innovative treatments with remarkable results. Unfortunately, many of these treatments are not available within military or veteran medical facilities for our heroes that I have previously discussed who are suffering from TBI. Our troops put themselves on the line every day, and I think they deserve every opportunity to receive this treatment that is available for their recovery. This pilot program created in NDAA will provide for that treatment and recovery. As has been talked about here on the floor of the House of Representatives, $10 million out of $19 billion should be allocated to this. I appreciate all of my colleagues not only learning more about this issue, wanting to be a part of how we can help these men and women making groundbreaking treatments for our nation's veterans and active duty soldiers. I thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back my time.
Gentleman yields back his time. Gentleman from New
Madam
Jersey.
Chairman, I move to strike the last word. We accept the gentleman's amendment, and we commend him for his
Gentleman's
advocacy.
recognized for 5 minutes. Gentleman from New Jersey is recognized for 5 minutes.
Will the gentleman yield?
Yes, I'll be happy
We
to
accept the amendment, too.
yield back.
I'll yield back. Gentleman's yield back. Any other member wishing to speak to the amendment? If not, the questions on the amendment offered by the gentleman from Texas. Those in favor will signify by saying aye. Those opposed say no. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it, and the amendment is agreed to. Clerk will read.
Page 31, line 19, Operational Test and Evaluation Defense, $191,292,000 to remain available until September 30th, 2013. Title V, Revolving and Management Funds, Defense Working Capital Funds, $1,575,010,000. National Defense CELIF Fund, $1,100,519,000. Title VI, Other Department of Defense Programs, Defense Health Program, $32,317,459,000, of which $16,092,272,000 be available for contracts under the TRICARE program, $632,518,000 to remain available until September 30th, 2014 for procurement, $1,187,206,000 available until September 30th, 2013 for research. Chemical Agents and Munitions Destruction Defense, $1,554,422,000, of which $401,768,000 shall be only for the Assembled Chemical Weapons Alternatives Program. Drug Interdiction and Counter-Drug Activities Defense, $1,208,147,000. Joint Improvised Explosive Device Defeat Fund, $220,634,000 to remain available until September 30th, 2014. Office of the Inspector General, $346,919,000. Title VII, Related Agencies, Central Intelligence Agency Retirement and Disability System Fund, $513,700,000. Intelligence Community Management Account, $458,225,000. Title VIII, General Provisions, Section 8001, no part of any appropriation shall be used for publicity not authorized by the Congress. Section 8002, provisions of law prohibiting the payment of compensation to any person not a citizen of the United States shall not apply to personnel of the Department of Defense. Section 8003, No part of any appropriation shall remain available for obligation unless expressly provided herein. Section 8004. No more than 20% of the appropriations are limited for obligation during the current fiscal year shall be obligated during the last 2 months of the fiscal year. Section 8005. The Secretary may transfer not to exceed $4 billion of working capital funds. Section 8006, with regard to specific programs in tables titled Explanation of Project Level Adjustments, the obligation of amounts appropriated for which the amounts appropriated exceed the amounts requested are hereby required to be carried out in the manner provided by such tables. Section 8007, the Department shall submit a report to establish the baseline for application of reprogramming. Section 8008, cash balances in working capital funds may be maintained in such amounts as are necessary for cash disbursements. Section 8009, funds appropriated may not be used to initiate a special access program without prior notification 30 calendar days in advance. Section 8010, none of the funds shall be available to initiate a multi-year contract that employs economic order quantity procurement in excess of $20 million in any 1 year, or a contract for advanced procurement leading to a multi-year contract that employs economic order quantity procurement in excess of $20 million unless congressional defense committees have been notified at least 30 days in advance. Funds appropriated in Title III of this Act may be used for a multi-year procurement contract as follows: UH-60M, HH-60M, and MH-60R/MH-60S helicopter airframes, and MH-60RS mission avionics and common cockpits. Section 8011, funds appropriated for operation and maintenance are hereby appropriated for humanitarian and civic assistance. Section 8012, during fiscal year 2012, the civilian personnel of the Department may not be managed on the basis of any end strength. The 2013 budget request for the Department shall be prepared and submitted to Congress. Nothing in this section shall apply to military civilian technicians. Section 8013, none of the funds shall be used to influence congressional action on legislation. Section 8014, none of the funds shall be available for the basic pay and allowances of any member of the Army participating as a full-time student. Section 8015, none of the funds shall be available to convert to contractor performance and activity of the Department that is performed by the Department civilian employees.
For what purpose does the gentleman from Michigan rise?
Madam Chair, I have an amendment at the desk.
Clerk shall designate the amendment.
Amendment number 46, printed in the Congressional Record, offered by Mr. Amash of Michigan.
Clerk will suspend the reading. And will the gentleman suspend the number of his amendment? Specify the amendment.
Amendment 62.
Clerk will designate.
Amendment number 62, printed in the Congressional Record, offered by Mr. Amash of Michigan.
Gentleman from Michigan.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Within the last month, the House has voted to strike problematic and anti-competitive A76 language from H.R. 2017, the Department of Homeland Security Appropriations Bill, and from H.R. 2112, the Agriculture Appropriations Bill. The same change and reversal of bad policy should be adopted in this legislation by striking Section 8015. My amendment does just that. As drafted, Section 8015 prohibits the Department of Defense from contracting out any function unless it will save a minimum of $10 million or 10% of the Department's performance costs, even if the contractor is less costly overall and can perform the work more efficiently. Independent studies have found that public-private competitions lower costs by between 10 and 40%, regardless of whether the competition is won by a private contractor or the government. Rather than stand in the way of public-private competitions, Congress should cut the red tape and make the use of this cost-saving process easier, not harder. The requirements in Section 8015 are largely codified in existing statute. Retaining Section 8015 will obstruct and potentially nullify any current efforts to reform the system in ways that improve public-private competitions and bring much-needed consistency and reliability to the process. Instead of complicating the use of competitions that improve service and lower costs, we should be encouraging agencies to find the most efficient way to deliver services. This amendment will send that message by reducing restrictions on the Department of Defense and making it easier to achieve reforms that will increase the availability of cost-saving competitions throughout the Department. I urge my colleagues to support this common-sense, taxpayer-first amendment to H.R. 2219. Thank you, Madam Chair. I yield back.
Gentleman from Michigan yields back the balance of his time. Gentleman from Washington.
I rise in opposition to the gentleman's amendment.
Gentleman's recognized.
This amendment would repeal Section 8015 of the bill, which in various forms has been included in the bill for the past 14 years. This section requires that before work is contracted out, the Department of Defense must conduct a formal cost comparison to determine whether privatization would actually save money. The section also provides an exemption to ease contracting with businesses owned by disadvantaged persons, qualified nonprofit entities for disadvantaged persons, or businesses owned by Native Americans. In cases where outsourcing is appropriate, one of the fundamental reasons would be lowering government operating costs. Requiring the DoD actually conduct this analysis under, I think it's A76 review, is reasonable and should be included in this bill. I urge my colleagues to reject this amendment, and I must say we have done these A76 reviews across the country, and many times we find that the government entity reorganizes itself and can actually do the work at a lesser cost than the private sector. And the other problem with this whole thing is once the private sector gets it, the costs go right through the roof. So you need to have analysis done after contracting out is done to make sure that you're not getting ripped off. So I strongly oppose the gentleman's amendment. I yield back my time.
Any further discussion on the gentleman's amendment from Michigan? If not, the question is on the amendment offered by the gentleman from Michigan, and those in favor will signify by saying aye. Opposed, say nay. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it, and the amendment is agreed to. The gentleman from Washington.
I ask for a recorded vote.
Recorded vote is requested, and pursuant to Clause 6 of Rule 18, further proceedings on the amendment offered by the gentleman from Michigan will be postponed. Clerk will read.
Page 51, line 9, Section 8016. Funds appropriated for the Department Pilot Mentor Protege Program may be transferred to any other appropriation contained in this Act for the purpose of implementing a Mentor Protege Program. Section 8017. None of the funds may be available for the purchase of welded shipboard anchor and mooring chain unless manufactured in the United States. Section 8018, none of the funds may be used to demilitarize M-1 carbines or destroy small arms ammunition or ammunition components that are not otherwise prohibited from commercial sale, unless certified by the Secretary of the Army as unserviceable or unsafe for further use. Section 8019, no more than $500,000 shall be used during a single fiscal year for any single relocation of an organization or function of the Department into or within the National Capital Region. Section 8012, in addition, $15 million is appropriated for incentive payments authorized by Section 504 of the Indian Financing Act of 1974. Section 8021, funds by this Act for the defense media activity shall not be used for any political activities. Section 8022, the Department is authorized to incur obligations not to exceed $350 million for purposes specified in Section 2350JC of Title 10, United States Code. Section 8023, funds made available in this Act not less than $30,945,000 shall be available for the Civil Air Patrol Corporation. The Secretary of the Air Force should waive reimbursement for any funds used by the Civil Air Patrol for counter-drug activities. Section 8024, none of the funds are available to establish a new Department of Defense federally funded research and development center as a new entity, a separate entity. No member of a board of directors or any similar entity of a defense FFRDC may be compensated for his or her services as a member of such entity. None of the funds to the department from any source may be used by a defense FFRDC for construction of new buildings. The funds available to the department may be for defense FFRDCs. The Secretary shall submit a report presenting the specific amounts of staff years of technical effort. The total amount appropriated for FFRDCs is reduced by $125 million. Section 8025, none of the funds shall be used to procure carbon or armor steel plate which were not melted in the United States or Canada. Section 8026, the term Congressional Defense Committees means the Armed Services Committee of the House, the Armed Services Committee of the Senate. Section 8027, the Department may acquire the modification and repair of aircraft through competition between the Department of Defense depot maintenance activities and private firms. Section 8028, if the Secretary or after consultation with the United States Trade Representative determines that a foreign country has violated terms of the agreement against certain products produced in the United States, the Secretary shall rescind the Secretary's blanket waiver of the Buy American Act.
Clerk will suspend. For what purpose does the gentlelady from Ohio rise?
I have an amendment at the desk.
Clerk will report the amendment.
Amendment offered by Ms. Sutton of Ohio. Page 60, line 9, insert after the period the following. Such report shall also indicate whether such items or parts of such items are available for purchase in the United States.
For what purpose does the gentleman from Florida rise?
Madam Chairman, I reserve a point of order on the gentlelady's amendment.
Point of order is reserved by the gentleman from Florida. The gentlelady from Ohio is recognized.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I rise today to shine a light on how America is spending defense dollars. This week, we will vote on a $530 billion defense budget. Some of that money will go towards pay for our soldiers. Some of that money will go towards ensuring military families are cared for. But when it comes to buying everything from building materials to fighter jets, as much of that money as possible should go towards buying American. Every dollar we spend on a part or a piece of equipment manufactured overseas, when we can easily build it at home, is doing our men and women in uniform and our manufacturing base a disservice. This is a clarifying amendment that will increase transparency within the Department of Defense by having the Department indicate whether parts purchased overseas are available here in the United States. Taxpayers deserve to know where their defense dollars are going. They want to see their taxpayer dollars used to purchase quality products and materials produced right here in the United States by American workers. And when that doesn't happen, they want and deserve to know why. Currently, the Department of Defense is granting tens of thousands of waivers to allow for taxpayer dollars to buy equipment made overseas. If our tax dollars are going to buy a part made overseas, taxpayers deserve to know if that part is available in Michigan or Ohio or anywhere else in the United States. My amendment simply uses the current Department of Defense data and the requirements set forth in this section and adds more transparency by highlighting areas where our government is sending money overseas instead of keeping it at home. If we are truly to put Americans back to work, we must make sure that Congress is doing everything it can towards that end. This amendment is one small step that we can take right now. This clarifying amendment will only serve to shine a light on taxpayer dollars being invested in the wrong place and show where those funds can be diverted in a way that can make a difference for jobs here at home. I encourage my colleagues to pass this common sense clarifying amendment to ensure increased transparency for American taxpayers and encourage our Department of Defense to buy American, because that is what taxpayers want and that is what American workers deserve. And I yield back.
The gentlelady from Ohio yields back the balance of her time. And the gentleman from Florida, does the gentleman continue to reserve his point of order?
Madam Chairman, I make a point of order against the amendment because it proposes to change existing law and constitute legislation in an appropriations bill, therefore violating Clause 2 of Rule 21. The rule states in pertinent part, an amendment to a general appropriations bill shall not be in order if exchanging existing law. This amendment imposes additional duties, and I ask for a ruling from the chair.
Any other member wish to speak to the point of order? The gentlelady from Ohio.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I rise in opposition to the point of order. This is simply a clarifying amendment. It clarifies information that's already being gathered in this section. Since 2007, Congress has mandated that the Department of Defense begin tracking waivers that allow the Department to buy products from overseas. Currently, to qualify for a waiver from the Buy America requirements, the Department of Defense has to comply with one of 8 criteria. One of those criteria is proving that there is no domestic product available. This section of the bill already requires the Department of Defense to report back to Congress on the amount of their purchases from foreign entities and the dollar value of items for which the Buy America Act was waived. My amendment simply uses the current Department of Defense data and the requirements set forth in this section and adds more transparency by highlighting areas where our government is sending money overseas instead of keeping it at home. As I said, if we are truly to put Americans back to work, we must make sure that Congress is doing everything it can towards that end. It would seem a shame for this objection to stand to an amendment that just ensures transparency in a section that is already being used to gather information. And I yield back.
Gentlelady yields back. Any other member wish to speak to the point of order? If not, the chair is prepared to rule. And the gentleman from Florida makes a point of order that the amendment constitutes legislation in violation of Clause 2 of Rule 21. Section 8028 of the bill constitutes legislation. It has been permitted to remain in the bill by way of a waiver of that point of order. And under the precedents, it may be modified by a germane amendment as long as the amendment does not contain additional legislation. The amendment modifies a report in Section 8028B of the bill. It requires the inclusion in the report of certain information regarding domestic availability of certain products. By requiring additional detail in the report, the amendment proposes additional legislation, and it therefore violates Clause 2 of Rule 21, and the point of order is sustained. Gentleman from Florida.
Madam Chairman, I move to strike the last word.
Gentleman from Florida is recognized for 5 minutes.
Madam Chairman, I do so to make this announcement that there are a number of points of order lying on amendments that we will be considering shortly. It will be my hope that we can reserve the point of order so that the member propounding the amendment can also have their 5 minutes to explain the amendment. And as long as that courtesy is not abused, I will continue to allow that. But if it does appear to be abused, then we will raise the point of order immediately.
The gentleman yields back. Clerk will read.
Page 60, line 1. The Secretary shall submit a report on the amount of Department purchases from foreign entities. The term Buy American Act means Chapter 83 of Title 41 United States Code. Section 8029. Amounts contained in the Department of Defense Overseas Military Facility Investment Recovery Account shall be available until expended for the payment specified by Section 2921C2 of that Act. Section 8030. The Secretary of the Air Force may convey without consideration to Indian tribes located in Nevada, Idaho, North Dakota, South Dakota, Montana, Oregon, Minnesota, and Washington relocatable military housing units located at Grand Forks Air Force Base that are access to the needs of the Air Force. The Secretary of the Air Force shall convey military housing units under subsection A. The Operation Walking Shield program shall resolve any conflicts among requests of Indian tribes for housing units. Indian tribe means any recognized Indian tribe included on the current list published by the Secretary of the Interior. Section 8031. Appropriations for operation and maintenance may be used to purchase items of not more than $250,000. Section 8032. None of the funds available to the Department of Defense working capital funds shall be used for the purchase of an investment item for the purpose of acquiring a new inventory item if such an item would not have been chargeable to the Department of Defense Business Operations Fund. The fiscal year 2013 budget request for the Department shall be prepared and submitted to the Congress on the basis that any equipment which was classified as an end item shall be budgeted for in a proposed fiscal year 2013 procurement appropriation and not in the supply management business area. Section 8033. None of the funds for programs of the Central Intelligence Agency shall remain available for obligation beyond the current fiscal year. Section 8034. Funds made available in this Act for the Defense Intelligence Agency may be used for the design and deployment of General Defense Intelligence Program intelligence communications. Section 8035. None of the funds under the heading Operation and Maintenance Defense-wide, not less than $12 million, shall be made available for the mitigation of environmental impacts. Section 8036. None of the funds may be expended by an entity of the Department unless the entity complies with the Buy American Act. If the Secretary determines that a person has been convicted of intentionally affixing a label bearing a Made in America inscription to any product that is not made in America, the Secretary shall determine whether the person should be debarred from contracting. It is the sense of the Congress that any entity of the Department purchase only American-made equipment. Section 8037. None of the funds shall be available for a contract for studies entered into without competition on the basis of an unsolicited proposal unless the head of the activity responsible for the procurement determines, as a result of thorough technical evaluation, only one source is found fully qualified to perform the proposed work. Section 8038. None of the funds made available may be used to establish a field operating agency. Section 8039. The Secretary, through the Office of Economic Adjustment of the Department, may use funds under the heading Operation and Maintenance Defense-wide to make grants. Section 8040. Funds are rescinded. None of the funds may be used for the construction of additional sea lift capacity. Section 8041. None of the funds may be used to reduce the authorized positions for military technicians of the Army National Guard. Section 8042. None of the funds may be obligated or expended to the Democratic People's Republic of Korea. Section 8043. Funds appropriated for operation and maintenance of the military department's combatant commands shall be available for reimbursement of pay, which would otherwise be incurred against appropriations for the National Guard and Reserve. Section 8044. None of the funds in this Act may be used to reduce the civilian medical and medical support personnel. Section 8045. None of the funds for drug interdiction of or counter-drug activities may be transferred to any other department or agency. None of the funds to the Central Intelligence Agency for drug interdiction may be transferred to any other department or agency. Section 8046. None of the funds may be used for the procurement of ball or roller bearings other than those produced by a domestic source. Section 8047. None of the funds may be used to purchase any supercomputer which is not manufactured in the United States. Section 8048. None of the funds may be used to pay the salary of any officer or employee of the Department who approves or implements the transfer of administrative responsibilities. Section 8049. None of the funds available to the Department may be obligated or expended to transfer to another nation. Section 8050. None of the funds shall be obligated to pay a contractor for costs of any amount paid by the contractor to an employee when such costs are for a bonus. Section 8051. No more than $30 million may be transferred to appropriations available for the pay of military personnel to be used in support of such personnel in connection with support for eligible organizations outside the Department pursuant to Section 2012 of Title 10, United States Code. Section 8052. In the case of an appropriation account for which the availability for obligation has expired and which has a negative unliquidated balance, an obligation may be charged to any current appropriation account for the same purpose as the expired or closed account if the obligation would have been properly chargeable. Section 8053. The Chief of the National Guard Bureau may permit the use of equipment of the National Guard Distance Learning Project by any person on a space available reimbursable basis. Section 8054, the Secretary of the Air Force may implement cost-effective agreements for required heating facility modernization in the Kaiserslautern military community in the Federal Republic of Germany. Section 8055, none of the funds may be used to procure end items for delivery to military forces for operational training. Section 8056, none of the funds may be used to approve or license the sale of the F-22A Advanced Tactical Fighter to any foreign government. Section 8057, the Secretary may waive with respect to a foreign country each limitation on the procurement of defense items from foreign sources if the Secretary determines that the application would invalidate cooperative programs. Section 8058, none of the funds may be used to support any training program involving a unit of the security forces or police of a foreign country. The Secretary shall ensure that full consideration is given to all credible information available. The Secretary, after consultation with the Secretary of State, may waive the prohibition. Not more than 15 days after the exercise of any waiver, the Secretary shall submit a report to the committees describing the purpose and duration of the training program. Section 8059, none of the funds available may be obligated for the purpose of performing repairs or maintenance to military family housing units. Section 8060, funds appropriated under the heading Research, Development, Test, and Evaluation defense-wide. Section 8061, the Secretary shall provide a quarterly report beginning 30 days after enactment of this Act to the House. Section 8062, none of the funds available to the Department may be used to provide support to another Department if such Department is more than 90 days in arrears in making payment for goods and services previously provided on a reimbursable basis. Section 8063, a reserve who is a member of the National Guard serving on full-time National Guard duty may perform duties in support of the ground-based elements of the National Ballistic Missile Defense System. Section 8064, none of the funds may be used to transfer to any non-governmental entity ammunition held by the Department that has a centerfire cartridge. Section 8065, the Chief of the National Guard Bureau may waive payment of the consideration under Section 2667 of Title 10, United States Code. Section 8066, none of the funds shall be used for the support of any non-appropriated funds activity of the Department that procures malt beverages. Section 8067, under the heading Operation and Maintenance, Army, $124,493,000 shall remain available until expended. Section 8068, Section 8106 of the Department of Defense Appropriations Act 1997 shall continue in effect to apply disbursements that are made by the Department. Section 8069, $4 million is hereby appropriated to the Department to remain available for obligation until expended. Section 8070, under the headings Procurement Defense-Wide and research, development, test, and evaluation defense-wide, $235,700,000 shall be for the Israeli cooperative programs. Section 8071, none of the funds may be obligated to modify command and control relationships to give Fleet Forces command, administrative, and operational control of U.S. Navy forces assigned to the Pacific Fleet. Section 8072, under the heading Shipbuilding and Conversion, Navy, $73,992,000 shall be available until September 30th, 2012 to fund prior year shipbuilding cost increases. Section 8074, funds appropriated for intelligence activities are deemed to be specifically authorized. Section 8075, none of the funds shall be available for obligation or expenditure through a reprogramming of funds that creates a new program unless such program must be undertaken in the interest of national security. Section 8076, the budget of the President shall include separate budget justification documents for costs of United States Armed Forces participation in contingency operations for the military personnel accounts. Section 8077, none of the funds may be used for research of nuclear-armed interceptors of a missile defense system. Section 8078, $44 million is hereby appropriated to the Department of Defense. Section 8079, none of the funds shall be used to reduce the operation of the 53rd Weather Reconnaissance Squadron of the Air Force Reserve. Section 8080, none of the funds shall be available for integration of foreign intelligence information unless the information has been lawfully collected. Section 8081, at the time members of reserve components, each member shall be notified in writing of the expected period during which the member will be mobilized. The Secretary may waive the requirements of subsection A, in which the Secretary determines that it is necessary to do so to respond to a national security emergency. Section 8082, the Secretary may transfer from any available Department of the Navy appropriation to any available Navy ship construction appropriation for the purpose of liquidating necessary changes resulting from inflation. Section 8083, any subdivision of appropriations made under the heading Shipbuilding and Conversion Navy that is not closed at the time reimbursement is made shall be available to reimburse the Judgment Fund. Section 8084, none of the funds may be used to transfer research and development relating to current tactical unmanned aerial vehicles. Section 8085, $15 million under the heading Operation and Maintenance Navy may be made available for the Asia-Pacific Regional Initiative Program. Section 8086, none of the funds shall remain available for obligation beyond the current fiscal year, except for funds appropriated for research and technology. Section 8087, any subdivision of appropriations under the heading Shipbuilding and Conversion Navy shall be considered to be for the same purpose as any subdivision under the heading Shipbuilding and Conversion Navy appropriations in any prior fiscal year. Section 8088, not more than 35% of funds may be obligated under indefinite delivery, indefinite quantity contracts with a total contract value of $130 million. Section 8089, the Director of National Intelligence shall include the budget exhibits in the Department Financial Management Regulation with the Congressional Budget Justification books for procurement programs requesting more than $10 million in any fiscal year. Section 8090, the Secretary shall create a major force program category for space for each future year's defense program. Section 8091, the Director of National Intelligence shall submit a report to establish the baseline for application of reprogramming authorities pursuant to Section 8092 of this Act for fiscal year 2012. Section 8092, none of the funds shall be available for obligation through a reprogramming or transfer of funds in accordance with Section 102 AD of the National Security Act of 1947. None of the funds shall be available for obligation in excess of $1 million that augments existing programs, projects, or subprojects. Section 8093, the Director of National Intelligence shall submit to Congress each year a future year's intelligence program reflecting the estimated expenditures and proposed appropriations. Section 8094, the term Congressional Intelligence Committees means the Permanent Select Committee on the Intelligence of the House, the Select Committee on Intelligence of the Senate. Section 8095, the Department shall continue to report incremental contingency operations costs for Operation New Dawn and Operation Enduring Freedom. Section 8096, $11 million from Title II of this Act for Operation and Maintenance Army, Operation and Maintenance Navy, and Operation and Maintenance Air Force may be transferred to its central fund for Fisher Houses and Suites. Section 8097, funds appropriated in the Intelligence Community Management Account, $22 million is available for transfer for government-wide information sharing activities. Section 8098, funds for operation and maintenance may be available for remittances to the Defense Acquisition Workforce Development Fund. Section 8099, any agency receiving funds shall post on the public website any report required to be submitted by Congress. B, subsection A shall not apply if the public posting of the report compromises national security or contains proprietary information. Section 8100, none of the funds may be expended for any federal contract in excess of $1 million unless the contractor agrees not to enter into any agreement with any of its employees or contractors that the employee or contractor agree to resolve through arbitration any claim. Section 8101, prohibition on conversion of functions performed by federal employees to contractor performance.
For what purpose does the gentleman from Texas rise?
Thank you, Madam Chairman. I have an amendment at the desk.
Clerk will report the amendment.
Amendment offered by Mr. Sessions of Texas. Strike Section 8101.
Gentleman from Texas.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. Madam Chairman, this month the House has voted twice to strike problematic and anti-competitive A76 language from H.R. 2112, the Agriculture Appropriations Bill, and H.R. 2017, the Department of Homeland Security Appropriations Bill. The same change and reversal of bad language should be adopted in legislation today by striking this anti-competitive language. My amendment would strike Section 8101 of this legislation, which, as drafted, prohibits the use of funds in the underlying bill to convert any functions performed by federal employees to private competition pursuant to a study conducted under OMB Circular A76. A76 cost comparisons between public and private sector brings the best value to the taxpayer. Lifting the current moratorium will reform the way the Department of Defense does business, allowing the flexibility to manage the most effective and efficient cost ways in supporting the mission of the Department of Defense. The role of government should be to govern, not to operate business inside the government. Currently, the federal government employs some 2 million executive branch, non-postal, full-time, and permanent employees. 850,000 of these employees hold jobs that are commercial in nature. The underlying principle of A76 is that the government should consider private sector performance of commercial services where appropriate. This notion has been consistently embraced by administrations of both political parties for more than 60 years. Over the past 2 years, the Obama administration has pushed for an insourcing campaign within DOD. Secretary Gates put a halt on that practice recently due to what Forbes magazine on March the 7th, 2011 called, and I quote, a victim of bad planning and disappointing results, end of quote. 2 years of shutting out private competition resulted in zero taxpayer savings. According to a Small Business Administration study, 71% of A76 goes to small business. This work is important and must be done well, but should be done also where the taxpayer sees results and the cost benefit. Anytime Congress places a restriction on agencies' ability to implement A76, such action denies opportunity for small business. Our nation's unemployment rate stands at 9.1%. We must allow the private sector the ability to create jobs without an unfair disadvantage. The A76 process allows the private sector just this opportunity. If competition is deemed fair, it doesn't matter who wins. As long as both sides are allowed equal opportunity for the job, the taxpayer ultimately wins. I urge all my colleagues to support this common-sense taxpayer First Amendment and to ensure that cost-saving competition is available throughout the Department of Defense. Thank you, Madam Chairman, and I yield back my time.
Gentleman from Texas yields back the balance of his time. The gentleman from Washington.
Yes, I rise in opposition to the gentleman's amendment.
The gentleman's recognized.
An amendment may be offered to strike Section 8101 from the bill. This section provides that the Defense Department must certify compliance with the fiscal year 2008 law, which requires DoD to provide an inventory of its service contracts, review those contracts, and then integrate those results into the budget process before using the OMB Circular A76 privatization process. So I rise in opposition to the gentleman's amendment. This provision is included in the fiscal year 2012 budget request. It requires that DoD exercise responsible stewardship over its contractors by providing an inventory of such contractors, a review of associated contracts, and an explanation of how these contracts are integrated into the budget. The provision requires the Department of Defense to maintain better accountability of the thousands of contractors performing services for the Department every day, and therefore maintain better accountability of funds. Striking this section releases the Department from this responsibility. And I must tell the gentleman from Texas, who's a good friend, that we had a terrific problem getting the Department of Defense to even be able to tell us how many contractors they have. And we had this problem in Iraq, we had this problem in Afghanistan, and we're still struggling. Now they give us a quarterly report of how many contractors and how many contract employees there are. I have always believed in the A76 review process, and in fact I had an amendment probably 25 years ago that said after you do A76, if you contract out to the private company, if they win the competition between the government unit and the private sector, that you have to keep analyzing what's happened to the cost. And what we found was, as soon as the thing was contracted out, the prices started to go up, and until we had this auditing process that looked into this. And then that was taken out, I think, somewhere in the 90s. And so we didn't have this mechanism to ensure that we were getting the best deal. And there were problems associated with pensions. Could you compare government pensions with private sector pensions? A lot of this was worked out. But the idea of not being accountable, not having these companies, you know, not having the government, the Defense Department, know how many service contractors it has and how much. So if we're going to reduce spending, we've got to know that. We've got to understand that. And I hope that we can continue to work on this problem, because the idea that Congress doesn't get the information that is necessary to how many people we've contracted out to is, I think, ridiculous. And I think Congress has to insist that we get this information.
Gentleman yield.
I yield, of course.
You know, I think the gentleman brings up not only very pertinent questions that the gentleman has dealt with throughout his career about how do we effectively utilize taxpayer dollar, but I would like to suggest to you that we're talking about commercial activities, mowing grass, painting buildings, doing lots of other things too, but doing things which are very essential to the upkeep and operation, but that within the Department of Defense, the base commander has a good grasp on this. Those people that are in the architecture group, those people that are in the operations group, they know who they're getting, and they're getting regular people who can come in and do the job that they're specified, then leave. Not have full-time employees that change oil, mow grass, do the painting, do all these things. And not in every location is it advantageous, but some it is. And we're talking about where they can use it to their advantage. That's where this would be utilized. And so, Norm, I'd like to spend a little time with you, but where it's an advantage for the department, we're giving them the opportunity. That's what this amendment's about. And I appreciate I yield back.
I think the A76 process has been a worthy one. Sometimes the contractor wins, and sometimes the unit of government reorganizes itself, and they compete, and it comes out that the government wins. So I think the A76 process has worked, and I hate to see us get rid of that. Now, the other thing is I think the department has to do a better job of accountability, of being able to report how many civilian employees, how many military employees, how many contractors. I ask unanimous consent. I have one additional minute.
Without objection.
And that's what I'm trying to get to. I think the idea that they can submit their budget but not be able to tell us how many contractors there are, how many contract employees there are, is just ridiculous.
Gentleman yield.
Yes, I yield.
If you want to get your grass mowed at a big base where you've got a lot going on, do you care how many employees, or just that you have the guy that's supposed to cut the grass, you hold him accountable even if he has 80 people working for him? That's the point that we're trying to make. Right. You don't have to know how many employees. You have to know that it got done at the right price. We're not doing away with the A76 process. Your points are well made. The gentleman is dead on, and I appreciate him
and I agree with the
yielding.
gentleman. If we can get a better deal, let's try to get a better deal. We can do it less expensively. We can do it less expensively. And I yield back my time.
Gentleman yields back. The gentleman from New York, for what purpose does he rise?
Madam Speaker, I move to strike the last word.
The gentleman from New York is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you. Madam Speaker, I'm sort of surprised by this amendment. It seems to me that if we want to have control over the contracts and the procurement process, if we want Congress to be able to know what's going on, if we want to be able to save money, which is what we keep talking about, you want the process that we have here. Perhaps you want an improved process, but you want an inventory. I mean, certainly no one will deny that some, perhaps many, of the private contracts that the Pentagon lets have been wasteful. Many have not been. But certainly an inventory, so that Congress can keep a closer eye on it, is calculated to reduce the waste, to reduce the wasteful expenditures, to enable us to have better oversight. So why you would want to change that, and this, I am given to understand that this provision originated with the Republican Congresses of the, during the Bush administration, and frankly it was a good innovation. Congress ought to be able to watch more closely what any government agency that is spending the kind of money the Pentagon is spending, hundreds of billions of dollars, much of it through private contracts. We ought to be able to watch what they're doing, watch what they're doing more closely, keep an eye on it, and be able to rein it in and say, hey, wait a minute, that contract is being well administered, but that one isn't. That contract we have a lot of questions about. So why would we want to eliminate that provision that has worked well? Now, granted, it hasn't worked as well as we've wanted. Granted, we ought to improve it. Perhaps someone could come up with an amendment with some language that would improve it. But to get rid of it, to say we don't need that oversight, we don't need that inventory of contracts, let the Pentagon do that in the dark of night, let the Pentagon have their contracts, and no one look at it. It seems to me rather unfrugal, rather wasteful, and not calculated to save the taxpayers' money. Why we'd want to do that, I don't know, so I have to oppose this amendment, and I yield back.
Gentleman from New York yields back. Any other member wishing to speak to the gentleman's amendment? If not, the question is on the amendment offered by the gentleman from Texas, and those in favor will signify by saying aye. Aye. Opposed say no. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it, and the amendment is agreed to. The gentleman from Washington.
Madam Chair, I ask for a recorded vote.
Recorded vote is requested, and pursuant to Clause 6 of Rule 18, further proceedings on the amendment offered by the gentleman from Texas will be postponed. For what purposes? The clerk will read.
Page 104, line 18. Section 8102, no national intelligence program funds in this Act may be used for a mission-essential business management information technology system that is not registered with the Director of National Intelligence. No funds may be obligated or expended for a financial management automated information system of more than $3 million without the approval of the Business Transformation Investment Review Board. Section 8103, none of the funds may be distributed to the Association of Community Organizations for Reform Now or its subsidiaries. Section 8104, funds appropriated for operation and maintenance for the Defense Health Program up to $132,200,000 shall be available for transfer to the Joint Department of Defense Department of Veterans Affairs Medical Facility Demonstration Fund. Section 8105, the Secretaries of the Army, Navy, Air Force, and the Directors of the Defense Agencies and Field Activities shall report to the committees within 60 days of enactment of this Act their plan for documenting the number of full-time contractor employees. Section 8106, Section 310B of the Supplemental Appropriations Act 2009, Public Law 111-32, 124 Stat 1871, as amended by Public Law 112-10, is amended by striking 2 years, both places it appears, and inserting 3 years. Section 8107, the Office of the Director of National Intelligence shall not employ more senior executive and general schedule 15 equivalent employees than are specified. Section 8108, none of the funds may be made available by this Act may be obligated or expended to pay a retired general or flag officer to serve as a senior mentor advising the Department. Section 8109, appropriations may be used for the purchase of heavy and light armored vehicles for the physical security of personnel or for force protection purposes up to $250,000 per vehicle. Section 8110, amounts appropriated for military personnel under Title I of the Act not to exceed 1% of each appropriation shall remain available until September 30th, 2013. Section 8111, amounts appropriated for operation and maintenance defense-wide, $33 million shall be available to the Secretary to make grants, conclude cooperative agreements, and to assist the civilian population of Guam in response to the military buildup of Guam. Section 8112, none of the funds may be used by the Secretary to operate more than 1,000 parking spaces provided by the BRAC 133 project and the lease of spaces in the immediate vicinity. Section 8113, none of the funds may be available for obligation or expenditure to relocate Air Force program offices or acquisition management functions of major weapon systems to any location other than the Air Force Material Command Site until 30 days after the Secretary submits the initial report. Section 8114, not later than 120 days after enactment of this Act, the Secretary shall resume monthly reporting of the numbers of civilian personnel and strength for every appropriation account used to finance federal civilian personnel salaries. Section 8115, in addition, $10 million is appropriated for Research, Development, Test, and Evaluation Army to remain available until September 30th, 2013. Section 8116, none of the funds are available to establish a new federally funded Research and Development Center, FFRDC. Section 8117, the Secretary shall study and report the feasibility of using commercially available telecommunications expense management solutions across the Department. Section 8118, none of the funds may be used to plan, prepare for, or take any action to undertake or implement the separation of the National Intelligence Program budget from the Department of Defense budget. Section 8119, none of the funds in Title II of this Act for operation and maintenance may be used for information operations, military information support operations activities. Section 8120, upon a determination by the Director of National Intelligence that action is necessary and in the national interest, the Director may transfer $1 billion of the funds made available in this Act to the intelligence community and associated agencies for intelligence functions. Section 8121, to reflect savings from revised economic assumptions, the total amount appropriated in Title II of this Act is hereby reduced by $501,800,000. The total amount appropriated in Title III of this Act is reduced by $484,800,000, and the total amount appropriated in Title IV of this Act is reduced by $323,500,000. Section 8122, in addition to amounts provided elsewhere, there is appropriated $250 million for operation and maintenance defense-wide. Section 8123, none of the funds may be used to transfer, release, or assist in the transfer or release to or within the United States, its territories, possessions, Khalid Sheikh Mohammed, any other detainee who is 1, not a United States citizen or a member of the armed forces, and 2, is or was held on or after June 24, 2009 at Guantanamo Bay, Cuba by the Department. Section 8124, none of the funds may be used to transfer any individual detained at Guantanamo to the custody or effective control of the individual's country of origin unless the Secretary submits to Congress the certification described by not later than 30 days before the transfer of the individual. Section 8125, none of the funds may be used to modify any facility in the United States to house any individual for the purposes of detention or imprisonment in the custody or under control of the Department. The prohibition shall not apply to any modification of facilities at United States Naval Station, Guantanamo Bay, Cuba. Section 8126, in general, funds made available to the Department under Operation and Maintenance Defense-wide in Title II, $1 million shall be available to conduct a forward-looking independent assessment of the current and prospective situation on the ground in Afghanistan and Pakistan. Not later than 120 days after enactment of this Act, the entity described in subsection A shall submit to the President and the Congress a report. Sense of Congress. It is the sense of Congress that the entity should be modeled on the Iraq Study Group. Section 8127, not more than $200 million may be expended for military